they were starving, really. They didn't have enough to eat. And his father told Bobby and his siblings, he said, when you grow up, I said, I want you to do something about this,
Mm-hmm.
whatever you can do
Mm-hmm.
to prevent this from happening.
Meaning that the corporations can contribute to.
Exactly. They can contribute much more than they used to be able to. And so they can basically buy a Congress, buy a president. But there's been this huge increase from, one in, I don't know, 10,000 kids when he was growing up. Now 1 in 22 boys.
74 of Americans are obese. Over 50% of kids are obese. 50% of Americans have prediabetes. Young adult cancers are up over 70%.
The reason I started work on the biography was not because he was running for president. I mean, he hadn't made any decision like that. But I was just so pissed off that the media was treating him so badly. Yet I knew a different guy. I knew a guy that I had a lot of respect for, that had fought very hard for environmental issues and public health issues, and so I thought there needs to be a book that would get that across.
That's a huge jump. Like, whatever you think is the cause of such a huge jump in autism, shouldn't that be the front page news in the world?
It should certainly be investigated heavily by the agencies that are supposed to be protecting us.
Yeah.
In the brains of so-called schizophrenics, like my son there's more DMT in their brains because they have this connection to other worlds than normal people. Because we did a series of divinations with a very renowned West African shaman named Malidoma Somé, and eventually, long story very short, went to West Africa.
The next day, I took some pictures of mountains in Palm Springs just because they looked beautiful. It was a really nice day, middle of the day. And hours later, I was just reviewing photos, and in those photos, I've seen a disc with like glowing disc in the sky, and there were two. Maybe let's start with your relationship with RFK Jr. How did you guys meet?
Yeah, I go back a long way with Bobby Kennedy. Back in 1998, I was doing research for what became a book on the migration of the California gray whales, and there was an environmental incursion going on at their main breeding habitat in Mexico and Baja California, and it was an amazing place where these friendly whales, as they're called, come up to people in the wild, and it's only been happening for like 30 years or so. And it started with just a fisherman out there on the lagoon, and they used to think these whales were, that they called them the devilfish because they used to be hunted there, and suddenly they started coming up to people, and it's a mystery to this day. But anyway, I went there and had that experience, and then there was a fight to save this lagoon, San Ignacio Lagoon, it was called, from um, this saltworks, industrial saltworks that Mexico and Mitsubishi were going to build there. And Bobby Kennedy was very involved in that with the Natural Resources Defense Council that he was a lawyer for at the time. So I met him and interviewed him, and we spent some time at the lagoon together. And then we just discovered we had other things in common, that he was a fisherman and loved to fish for striped bass, and I did too. And I had actually been part of a big environmental campaign to save the striped bass from overfishing and near extinction. And so we had environmentalism as a common denominator between us, and that's really where our relationship began and what it kind of focused around for many, many years.
Okay, awesome. And if you were to sort of describe him to someone who has never heard about him before, as a human being, how would you describe him basically?
Well, very passionate about what he does and his work, and that's been true from the very beginning. He was an amazing speaker on environmental issues, especially during the Bush era, when environmental laws were just being ripped apart by the administration. And so, but he's also somebody who really truly loved animals, and he had a whole room in his house when I first met him that he some of it was taxidermy, but he had a lot of animal, you know, skins of snakes and all these kinds of things from different parts of the world that he'd been, and of course he had dogs and he had horses, and he was a real animal lover. Wanted to be a veterinarian when he was a kid, actually. And so he was a committed environmentalist and somebody that I just not only admired his speaking ability and his ability to he wrote a great book called Crimes Against Nature back in the early 2000s, and he's a good writer, but also somebody with a lot of what his father, Robert Kennedy, used to call moral courage.
Mhm.
And he wasn't afraid to take on the powers that be,
Mhm.
and which he did, and as a passionate environmental advocate for years,
Right.
and was widely respected for that.
Okay. Yeah, definitely a courageous person, right? That's like the first thing I see or feel when I sort of study his life and his career. Um, and he went through a lot of trauma in his life,
Yep.
but he was born into a very affluent and famous family. Like, how was his childhood before, even before John Kennedy assassination?
Well, he had an amazing childhood. He grew up in Hickory Hill, Virginia, which is a very rural area, and then, his family had, stable horses and cows, and so it was kind of bucolic, I guess you'd say, in that way, and yeah, his family got very connected to Rachel Carson, who this was sort of the beginning of an environmental consciousness in him,
Hmm.
and she was the woman who wrote Silent Spring, which was about the dangers of DDT being sprayed everywhere and
Is what
poison.
was killing mosquitoes, right?
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
supposed to be killing mosquitoes, but it
Yeah.
was actually harming people.
Hmm.
I remember when I was a kid, they'd come to my neighborhood in suburban Chicago and they'd spray DDT, and you had to run for your house
Really?
beforehand, or you're going to get hit with it. And actually, I remember one of my first little girlfriend in fifth grade. She died of leukemia at a very young
Really?
age. I think probably because of that situation. But anyway, his family knew Rachel Carson, and she was vilified, by Monsanto, the chemical company, and saying that this was all bullshit. But the Kennedys uh, took her in, not to live with them, but they had her over for dinner, and
Hmm.
eventually DDT got banned. Took a long time, 1973.
Right.
Um, but this was kind of his first awareness of not just the need for environmental protection, but also what certain powers the chemical companies and the big media would do to somebody in that position, which he later faced big time in his own
Hmm.
life.
Right. Right. Yeah, I also heard that DDT was disrupting the eco chain. So
Yeah,
because it was killing so many insects,
yep,
some birds died that were feeding on those insects. And
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So then, in John F. Kennedy was assassinated. How old was Bobby when that happened?
He was born in 1954, so he was only
9.
yeah, 9, almost 10 years old
Okay,
when that
so he
happened.
was old enough to sort of have opinions and remember.
Oh yeah, I
Yeah.
mean he was close to his uncle.
Right.
They used to hang out, and he'd visit him in the White House, and gave
Hmm.
him a pet salamander once that he'd raised when he was, at Hickory Hill, and um, yeah, he was definitely, and with his father too, used to take him out on the Hudson River, which was not too far. In New York, and which at the time was this terribly polluted waterway,
Hmm.
one of the worst in the country. And his father used to tell him, about how what pollution was doing to killing all the fish. They couldn't eat the fish from the river, and so this was again, something in his young consciousness that was sort of ingrained from the time he was a kid. They used to
Hmm.
sit around the dinner table, which was a tradition actually, and it happened with his father and his uncle when they were young. They used to have their father, Joe Kennedy, used to have these family debates, right?
Hmm.
And they would get into the issues of the day, and they'd take different sides. And so this was what happened with Bobby and he had 10 siblings, so there were
Right.
11 kids.
Right.
And they used to debate all kinds of issues around the dinner table. And his father would come back, say, from a trip to Mississippi.
Hmm.
This was the civil rights era.
Right.
And so it was Martin Luther King was alive, Malcolm X. I mean, there was a huge ferment in the country around voting rights and poverty. And I remember a story. His father came back from Mississippi this time, and and there was these children there with, distended bellies because they were starving, really. They didn't have enough to eat. And his father told Bobby and his siblings, he said, "When you grow up," I said, I want you to do something about this,
Hmm.
whatever you can do
Hmm.
to prevent this from happening."
Yeah. It seems to be like a common thread in the Kennedy family where they would sort of stand up for the weaker, for people that didn't have a voice. They would have a strong sense of ethics and strong moral code. What do you think? Where did that come from? Because it seems to be like a thread that started with the president. Bobby's father seemed to be also like that, and Bobby very much so. Do you think it's genetic, or is it something that maybe their grandfather instilled in them?
It's a little hard to say. I think they were people, his uncle and his father, who grew in office. What I always respected most about them, and I studied that era very extensively earlier, before I ever met Bobby Jr. And it was a matter of in those days. I mean, we were close to annihilation. You and I wouldn't be sitting here talking if the Kennedys had not been in power. I don't think. And
Mm-hmm.
and with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the world was closer to nuclear war than I think we've ever been
Mm-hmm.
before or since. And they had to be up against their own Joint Chiefs of Staff in the military to do something about that, and not so it wouldn't happen. And it eventually, I think, led to the death of President Kennedy because, well, we can talk about that later.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
but they basically an accommodation was made where he became the peace president. And connected to Nikita Khrushchev in the
They had
Soviet
a
Union.
phone, right?
Yeah, they had a hotline that
Yeah.
they could communicate with each other, and they had a back channel of communication too that
Mm-hmm.
existed after the missile crisis.
Right.
And so they weren't strong civil rights advocates either in the beginning, but they were willing to listen. And there's a famous meeting that Robert Kennedy had when he was in the Attorney General. He brought together a bunch of the black leaders in the country to talk and expected it might be just a sort of a cordial exchange because they were trying to do what they could.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it wasn't. They were really upset that the Kennedys weren't doing more, to help in things like Martin Luther King was trying to do, so it was not an easy meeting, but I think it affected Robert Kennedy a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and he was able to then grow and change as time went on, and after his brother was killed in 1963, I mean, he went into a period of real seclusion, and he read the Greeks and he read Camus, and he felt, I mean, he was devastated,
Mm-hmm.
but became a truly compassionate person
Yeah.
in the course of that, who by the time the terrible tragedies of 68 took place when Martin Luther King was killed, he walked out got off a plane in Indianapolis and had to tell the crowd of mostly black people where when he was campaigning for president that what had happened to Martin Luther King. And he did it with such feeling and sadness and what he'd been through with his own brother's death
Mm-hmm.
that Indianapolis was the only city in the country where nobody rioted after that, the only big
Really?
city. And
Because they probably felt that he's genuine in the way he talks about it,
yeah,
right? And he feels
they
bad.
really did. And
Right.
so, yeah, it was where does it come from? I think it was life lessons that they learned as they went along.
Right.
Sure, there was probably ancestral parts of it too, but
Right.
but I mean, when President Kennedy came into office, he was a cold warrior, and his brother Bobby was known as a pretty ruthless guy as
Uh-huh.
Attorney General, and that was not the case as the years went by because they were willing to
Mm-hmm.
change and
Right. Right.
grow as people.
Yeah. JFK was famously talking about breaking up the CIA.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. So he did. Maybe he came to power and he really realized what it's all about, how it works, and he disagreed with it, and he wasn't afraid to stand up to it, right?
yeah, and
Yeah.
at the same time, he took responsibility for the Bay of Pigs invasion, which maybe some of your viewers have heard about. It was we set out to after Cuba looked like they were going to they had become communist and they were leaning more toward the Fidel Castro was in power in the revolution, and so there was an attempt by the CIA and been fomented during the earlier administration of President Eisenhower to overthrow Castro. And Kennedy approved the invasion that the CIA brought to him, and then it was a complete disaster. I mean, Castro's forces, basically took a lot of those guys prisoner who had been
Hmm.
part of that invasion, and so he went before the American people. He said, I'm president of the United States. I take responsibility for this, but he also ended up firing Allen Dulles as the head of the CIA and two of his top aides
Hmm.
by the end of that year for having thrust this upon him and then pretty much demanding that he provide air cover. And he didn't want to do it because, he didn't want to have the U.S. involved in that way.
Yeah.
So,
I think I heard RFK Jr. talk about it, where he said that they kind of set him up a little bit, whereas
yeah, they did.
they knew that the invasion will not work,
Right.
but they were hoping that if the president sees that it doesn't work, he will actually um,
He'll have to.
allocate more military resources,
Exactly.
and he didn't do
And
that
he didn't
either.
do it.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly right.
So when JFK was assassinated, how did that affect Bobby?
Well, he was 10 years old. He was there, of course, for the funeral. I remember he, at the time, thought, even when Jack Ruby shot the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, he said, why did he do that? Did he love our family?
Hmm.
Was he taking revenge, against
Yeah.
this guy? Well, and it took many, many years before he realized that there was a lot more to it than
Hmm.
that. Because,
Right.
I think the assassination of his uncle and even his father later, were such painful events for the family that they just really didn't want to go there to
Hmm.
look beyond what was the official
Yeah.
verdict at the time, that they had these lone assassins who had taken out their family members.
Right. Right. So then RFK decides to run for president, um, and he's also assassinated. That had to be an extremely painful situation, obviously, right? It's hard to imagine for someone who didn't go through it, but had to be, shattering. And
Oh,
especially
yeah.
he was 14, so
He was
he,
14 years old,
yeah,
and yeah, it was absolutely devastating, and he tells the story of being in his father's study. That I guess after Los Angeles, when he gotten back to Washington D.C. right before the funeral, and he was there and looked on the walls, and there were pictures of other family members, and he realized that they were all dead. This aunt who had been killed in the plane crash, and then his uncle,
hmm,
and his father's very close friend came in to be in the room and comfort him, and all just said, he was the best man they ever knew.
hmm,
And Bobby just kind of blanked out, after that. He said, I don't remember anything after that.
right,
So yeah, it was. You can imagine for all of them, it was a terribly traumatic event, and for him, it took a long time, for him to. I don't think he ever recover from something like that, but to even come to grips with it, and he was a very rebellious kid after
right.
that.
So, what happened after that? It's well known that he was struggling with drug addiction. Did it start right after that, or did it take some time to develop?
It wasn't too long after. I mean, I think he was like 15, and he'd been busted for smoking pot, and then he just took off. And I tell the story in my biography of him, the real RFK Jr., of how he just went out to the West Coast, hitchhiked, and ended up riding freight trains, living with bums,
Mm-hmm.
not even telling them that he was a Kennedy. Nobody knew who he was.
Mm-hmm.
He was just this young, long-haired kid, and came back after several months and was broke and called his mom, and he said, "Oh, can you help me get to the vineyard?" And she said, "Get a job." He said she was tough love. I
Mm-hmm.
mean,
Yeah.
that took a long time for him to reconcile with her. And then, he became eventually a heroin addict for
Mhm.
a period of time. He took LSD when he was, 15. As a lot of it was the 60s, it was
Yeah.
a lot of young people growing up at that time, including myself, were experimenting with, different substances
Yeah.
and realizing that, hey, things weren't necessarily what they seemed, and we've got a Vietnam War that we don't want to go to and fight. And
Yeah.
he's younger than I am. He's like 7 years younger. But for him, he did. He was a very, as he put it, high functioning addict.
Mhm.
So he could,
He was in Harvard, right? Like maybe.
yeah, he went to these prep schools, and then he went to Harvard, and then he went to the University of Virginia Law School,
Mhm.
and toward getting a law degree. And so and this whole time he was, going into Harlem and scoring drugs in very dangerous situations and survived it. But eventually it caught up with him.
Mhm.
And after, I think it was 15 years, he was on a plane uh, going to actually see this man in South Dakota who was helping him get straight. But on the plane, had OD'd, and it went into rehab. Was arrested after that flight, and he was in his late 20s then. He was like 28. And it's a story that, I'm not telling out of school here. I mean, he wanted me to write about it in the biography
Mhm.
because he felt it was a huge turning point in his life, and very important for people to know uh, how he not really coped well, how he coped with it, I guess. He well, he started reading a lot. And going through a period of very intense rehab, and and then it's what really led him into the environmental movement when he never went back. I mean, he went into AA
Mhm.
and is goes to AA meetings to this day. And he said the big thing that was that he didn't want to be addicted. But he said he just didn't have the willpower to do anything about it. And so he, has realized that he's got to continue to keep focused and not allow himself to go to that place anymore, and he never has.
Yeah.
And it led him into the environmental movement and, to becoming an environmental lawyer.
Mhm. It seems like he was searching for meaning. Like maybe after all those strategies, his worldview was shattered,
Yeah.
and he was trying to make sense of it all, and he didn't see any sense. He didn't find any meaning, and that's when people usually turn to alcohol and drugs to sort of fill the void.
Yeah, sure.
They feel pain and void, and that sort of keeps them alive in a way. And the only way to get out of it is to find the meaning, right? To
Yeah.
replace that sort of artificial hedonistic pleasure with something of actual meaning. And I think when he did quit drugs and alcohol, or maybe just drugs, I'm not sure if he was
It
drinking
was alcohol too.
alcohol, yeah, he did. He has found meaning in environmental work, right?
Yeah, and even at the time, he started off as in the prosecutor's office in LA. I mean, not LA, in New York. And, he was pretty good at it, but he knew that it wasn't quite doing it for him.
Mm,
Something else he was supposed to do. And he found he actually rekindled a passion for, the outdoors and for animals that he'd had when he was a kid. Um, because he continued even when he was going through the period where he was still addicted, but he would have these whitewater rafting trips, and he would take friends with him to Latin America, and they would, conquer these, rivers that had never been successfully rafted before,
mhm.
with tremendous waterfalls and, dangerous stuff. I mean, he could have, bought the farm there too, a couple of times, but
Yeah.
uh, so he continued his passion for the water. But once he joined a new organization called Riverkeeper, and got into helping clean up the Hudson,
Mhm.
and going after polluters both on the ground, wading through the muck to track the where this poison was going that these companies were putting out, and then suing them,
Mhm.
and mounted many successful lawsuits. And this was in the mid 1980s and onward, and just made the river fishable again and swimmable,
Mhm.
and then he expanded that to other areas of the country. He took on the factory farm folks who were polluting the waterways with the hog waste in North
Right.
Carolina. And Um, and there he was, this there were the big company put a goon on him, to track him and attend all of his speeches and harass him and, did whatever they could
Yeah.
to disrupt his efforts. So, but then this led to the formation of the Waterkeeper Alliance, which
Mhm.
still exists, and it's got 300 some, um, waterkeepers all over the world now, in different places, protecting at the grassroots level their
Mhm.
local waterways. So
Right.
it's the biggest organization of its kind on the planet.
Right. So this is like the first place where he has encountered corporate capture, sort of a government agencies, EPA, I think, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
in this case, the EPA,
Yeah.
and um, yeah, it's become a huge theme of his. It was in the early 2000s too, when the Bush administration had the people in charge of the EPA,
Mhm.
and he started talking about agency capture
Right.
and how the very government bodies that were supposed to be protecting all of us
Mhm.
were in fact in bed with the polluters,
Right.
and there was like a revolving door which would go back and forth between,
Mhm.
the polluting industry and the government agency.
Right.
And he started talking about that,
Yeah.
and he talked even then in the early 2000s about Mussolini's definition of fascism, which was a merger of state and corporate power.
Right. Yeah.
And so he was aware of these things, and he was aware too of how the big media began to be more and more sort of in league with this military and industrial, chemical, pharmaceutical
Yeah.
complex.
Yeah. Yeah, it does seem like in reality we live more so in fascism than democracy, right? Because it does seem like even the democratic candidates that we're allowed to vote for are kind of handpicked and vetted by the corporations, by the big money.
Well, certainly, yeah. And since the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, which declared that corporations are people, um, there've been campaign contributions opened up even.
Meaning that the corporations can contribute to, yeah.
Exactly. They can contribute much more than they used to be able to. And so they can basically
Mm-hmm.
buy a Congress, buy a president.
Right.
And we've been seeing more efforts in that direction,
Mm-hmm.
certainly in recent years.
Yeah, yeah. So then, like, fast forward, I guess, Bobby was trying to was making efforts to get mercury out of fish, right?
Yep.
Because I guess of the pollution, there was a lot of mercury that was causing lowering of IQ and brain damage, basically, in children and in people in general. And he has noticed that there was a lot of women coming, talking
Mhm.
about their children.
It was, I think, the success of the Fauci book, which, when that book came out, um, nobody reviewed it.
Hmm.
Um, most bookstores wouldn't take it. Almost all the sales were done on Amazon, and it sold to this day, counting the ebooks and everything, but close to 1 million copies. So
Hmm.
that was all word of mouth and Amazon sales.
Yeah.
And I think that success of that book made him realize that there was a hunger, at least in quite a few people, for something different than the established narrative,
Hmm.
to know something else might be going on.
Yeah.
And he was, there were a lot of things that were bothering him. I like I said, I'd known him for a long time. We'd worked together on different projects over the years in the environment. I wrote two books on climate change, or two editions of a book on climate change, Horsemen of the Apocalypse and then Climate in Crisis. And he wrote the introductions to both those books. So,
Hmm.
we'd worked together, and uh, and so the reason I started work on the biography was not because he was running for president. I mean, he hadn't made any decision like that. But I was just so pissed off that the media was treating him so badly, and just maligning him and accusing him of this and that. I mean, this has been going on, for some years now.
Hmm.
And yet I knew a different guy. I knew a guy that I had a lot of respect for, that had fought very hard for environmental issues and public health issues, and so I thought there needs to be a book that would get that across.
Mhm.
So I went to Skyhorse, and just published a number of my books, and his actually.
Mhm.
Tony Lyons, the publisher, is a friend, and I said, "What about this?" And he said, "Okay, go ahead and do it."
Yeah.
So I started interviewing Bobby at his house, and I started interviewing people about him, and then there was a period, I guess, early, not this year, but last year, I was out at his house, and he said, I think I'm going to have to run." Said, "The country's just so divided,
Mhm.
and I feel like my candidacy can help heal that divide."
Mhm.
And so and he was running as a Democrat. His family had always been Democrats,
Mhm.
and so that was a couple of months later. He made the announcement in Boston, and he wanted to stay as a Democrat,
Mhm.
but the fact that he eventually realized was that there's just no way. I mean, they're not even going to let him in the primaries in a
Mhm.
legitimate way,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it was going to be Joe Biden or nobody at
Mhm.
that point.
Yeah.
And that's not really democracy, but
No.
uh, so he didn't really have a chance, except to suddenly decide, 6 months later, to
Mhm.
drop out of the Democratic Party and become an independent.
Right. And he got a lot of support still. I mean, between 15-20%
Yeah, he
in
was
some polls.
polling in
Yeah.
the up to 20%
Yeah.
for quite a while there in the beginning.
Mhm. And so recently, it seems like he realized that only less than 3 months until election, he doesn't have a clear path to victory, and he made a pretty controversial decision to endorse Donald Trump. Um, it seems like he did that because Donald Trump was the only one of the two candidates that would listen to him and perhaps offer him a position in a cabinet. The Democrats would not do that, and uh, he said that he felt so strongly about the chronic disease epidemic in the U.S. with a lot of toxic things, ingredients in food and agriculture, that something has to be done about it. And he probably, from his standpoint, it seems like the only way he could actually be effective at that is if he had some kind of position in a government. Donald Trump, at least saying, who knows if he's going to follow through or not, that he would offer that. He made a decision to endorse him. How do you feel about it?
I wrote him a letter the night before that happened. I've still seen Bobby in the course of the campaign, but not as much because he's been really busy and traveling and meeting people and doing what he could. But I urged him not to do this, not to, because there were rumors that he would, and his vice presidential candidate, Nicole Shanahan, had come out and said they were considering this. And, I didn't think it was a good idea because, I mean, what happened before, at least in 2016, when President Trump became president,
Mm-hmm.
um, there was talk of that Bobby would run a vaccine commission that Trump wanted to do. And that he came to Washington, had a meeting with Trump. I mean, they'd known each other anyway in New York and like that before Bobby moved to California. But then, what the story is, Pfizer, the big company, eventually created the COVID vaccine. One of them went to Trump and said, "We'll give you $1 million," or maybe they already had, "and we'll give you $1 million for your inauguration."
Mm-hmm.
But this guy Bobby Kennedy shouldn't be running a vaccine commission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I don't have record of that conversation, but that's
Yeah.
the story that I have heard and wrote about in the book. And
Mm-hmm.
and so, you know, what that meant to me was Donald Trump is not going to necessarily follow through on something if
Mm-hmm.
there's a big corporation involved that was also a big campaign contributor, that kind of thing.
Right.
So I do not trust the fact that Donald Trump is going to come through. But I know that that is why, and I watched Bobby's speech, and he was pretty anguished. That this was not something he took lightly or did because of personal ambition. I don't think.
No.
He's not that kind of guy.
Just look at his life work, right? I mean,
Yeah,
most of the stuff he did was he was working, fighting for other people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so I mean, time will tell if
Mm-hmm.
he made a bad decision to do that or not, but certainly he tried first to speak to Kamala Harris, and she didn't want to talk to him, and a lot of the Democratic, party wouldn't talk to him, and um, they have their reasons, but Trump was willing to talk to him
Mm-hmm.
and at least discuss possibilities for the future, and so as he said recently, he said, he said, I'm 70 years old. And if I can, if I can become involved basically in public health
Mm-hmm.
work, and we're in a situation in this country now where more than 50% of the population has a chronic disease,
Mm-hmm.
and many more children are obese than
Mm-hmm.
that even,
Mm-hmm.
and partly because of the kinds of foods that being given to them.
Right.
And he said, if I can save one kid
Mm-hmm.
at my age, it's still worth it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, I really think he's sincere in that.
Yeah.
He's also sincere in wanting to see an end to the war in the Ukraine, and
Mm-hmm.
to at least making an effort to have some kind of negotiations, which so far the current Democratic administration has not been willing to do,
Mm-hmm.
as we pour millions and millions of dollars from our big corporations into that war.
Yeah.
And so number of his positions were, I think, probably closer to Donald Trump than to the Democrats at this point. Not all of them, and he
Mm-hmm.
and Trump, I'm sure, don't agree on climate change and
Yeah.
a lot of environmental issues, and so I don't know if he got into some cabinet position like Health and Human Services, how much leeway he would have to actually do something if it got in the way of some of these companies.
Mm-hmm. At least he would have some kind of leeway or some
He would,
word.
and
Yeah.
that's what he's looking for.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important that there's still the effort for independent parties in this country. I personally feel that the two-party system doesn't work anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That it doesn't really adhere to what this country is about in terms of our democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And you see what's gone on with basically Biden being anointed, and then he bows out, and Kamala Harris is chosen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was nobody had any qualms about that. And in a democracy, I think Bobby Kennedy would have had a shot at
Mm-hmm.
because he had huge poll numbers at one
If
point.
he was allowed to debate, he would probably
If
win the
they
debate. Yeah.
they wouldn't let him in the debates,
Yeah.
wouldn't let him in the primaries, wouldn't let him in the debates. Used different maneuvers to keep him out. So in that sense, he was kind of forced into this position.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we need independent parties in this country that are actually allowed to be viable.
Mm-hmm.
And that effort is still going to go on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think it should, because right now, you know, there's a poll that has showed that more than 50% of the American people would actually rather have an independent candidate instead of one of the candidates for the two parties
Yeah.
that currently are running.
Right.
And I would think that that's something that should be listened to, because that's the will of the people.
Exactly. Yeah. And also, every time there's a big centralization of power, that leads to corruption, right? The less
Sure.
choices we have,
Yeah.
the bigger the risk that
Yeah.
something can go wrong, right?
Exactly.
Because there's no dissenting voices. So, yeah, it is strange that the U.S. only has two candidate system. In Europe, most of countries, I think, there's many parties, many candidates.
Yeah, there are. There's green parties have been very successful, like in Germany, for example.
Yeah.
And they have seats in parliament, and it's not an ideal system either, but at least
Hmm.
there's more opportunities for people to voice what they want to see.
Right. One hope I have is that a lot of Trump supporters seem to resonate with the ideas of ending the chronic disease epidemic and cleaning up the food system and cleaning up the FDA. They all seem to agree with Bobby on that, and so um, if Trump went back on his word and didn't honor his word, he would piss off a lot of his base. And since Donald Trump does care about what
Hmm.
people think of him, I think there's a chance that he will honor that. I also think that in the end, he probably does have a heart in the right place Trump, and maybe, deep down he really does care about this stuff too. That
Well, I hope you're right.
you know,
I mean, at this point,
yeah,
he did what he did, Bobby, and he'll be supporting Trump in his campaign. And it's weird actually. I mean, to me, because I mean, I'm certainly not a MAGA person. I
hmm
mean, most of my life I consider myself a liberal or progressive Democrat,
hmm
and supported those values and still do. But those values that existed when his family, his father and his brother were around, they've changed a lot, and
hmm
we've become much more of a money-dominated corporate society, an
hmm
oligarchy in a sense,
yeah,
and so that it's a different world. And I don't know if there's a way to. I think we need to, in a sense, turn back the clock, but also, move it forward so that the new world of social media is not listening necessarily to edicts from the administration to censor Bobby Kennedy,
right,
and that's what's happened.
yeah,
He got kicked off Instagram. Facebook went after him,
hmm
and there's now lawsuits. That his people have mounted to try to do something about that, and
yeah,
one of them it looks like it's pretty successful. And even Mark Zuckerberg came out the other day and
yeah,
apologized, for the censorship that
yeah.
his company has been imposing at the behest of, the
Biden
Democratic
administration,
Party.
yeah,
And so it's very worrisome. The
hmm
the First Amendment that Bobby has talked about a lot, I think, is a vital, part of our Bill of Rights, and
hmm
it's in jeopardy. And
right.
people have to realize that, and make their voices heard to do something about it.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very slippery slope towards totalitarian. Like people who have not experienced it or who don't really study history, they don't appreciate, I think, how grave of a danger it is
Yeah.
to go that route. And it's always like the people in history in general, like people who impose the totalitarian system, they always do it not because they explain it as, oh, that's the right way to go. No, they do it because they say, we needed to do it for your protection, for your safety.
Yeah.
If we don't do it, something really bad will happen. Therefore, we have to impose our views and stuff like
It's the
that.
fear factor, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. Like I actually have some stats in terms of a chronic health um, epidemic that it's interesting too because US seems to be one of the countries that's most affected by this. Um, like for example, in Europe, how system works, how health agencies work is that if you want to approve an ingredient that will be added to foods or anything,
hmm
you have to first prove that it's safe, meaning that you have to have a bunch of health data and studies showing that this is safe for human consumption.
right.
Apparently, in the US, it doesn't work this way. How it works in the US is that it's considered safe until proven otherwise.
Mm.
So you have a lot of chemicals and additives that are here in US in the food system that are banned in Europe.
hmm
And there's hundreds of them apparently. Um, and um, and that's really worrisome because if you have to prove that it's harmful if you want to take something out of the system, it takes time to do those studies, and those studies could be refuted and stuff like that. So you can have chemicals in food that will be there for a long time, and they will be only taken out after years of data showing that, let's say, they cause cancer or whatever. Uh, in Europe, it's the other way around. You have to first prove that it's safe.
hmm
Yeah, the US is an amazing country that gives a lot of opportunity, but it's also a country that, um, that I've noticed that uh, the laws are sort of kind of written to benefit um, the powerful and prioritize gain and profit making, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And things that are added to products like glyphosate, which is ubiquitous, and it's put into products like Roundup and Monsanto's product that actually, in the course of not too distant past, Bobby was part of a legal team that took on Monsanto and their use of glyphosate because it was, and the courts upheld that this groundskeeper who had been using Roundup to spray, various weeds and trees and everything, and he'd had an accident with it, and then he got terrible non-Hodgkin's lymphoma,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of people this was happening to. So he won a multi-million dollar settlement, which is still being kind of kicked around in the courts as to how much they're going to give him. But that was a big victory in recent years that Bobby Kennedy was part of.
Right. Yeah, I read about that. That's and I'm glad they won that. But Roundup is still used, but only in a commercial setting,
That's
right?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, those stats are pretty crazy. That 74 of Americans are obese, over 50% of kids are obese, 50% of Americans have prediabetes. Young adult cancers are up over 70%. 2 million cases of cancer right now are in the US, apparently, which is the highest it's ever been, apparently. 25% of women are on antidepressants, and 40% of 18-year-olds have some kind of mental health diagnosis.
It's pretty shocking.
It is pretty shocking. And, in this kind of setting, how can people reach their highest purpose and live great life if physically they're suffering,
Yeah.
they're being poisoned, right? And even me, 2 months ago, I decided to try gluten-free diet. I never thought I'm allergic to gluten, but I just figured I'm going to try and see what happens. And I do feel much better.
You do. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like my mood is better. I'm healthier. I have less inflammation. I can run longer. So clearly there was something in gluten that was,
Hmm.
making me unwell. I do feel like I'm able to perform better and almost like I can reach my purpose in life much easier, right? So what if we cleaned up the food system so
Yeah.
that every person could do that? How much growth and spiritual growth and in general growth would appear in the
Yeah.
world if we did that,
I
right?
think you're absolutely right, and
Yeah.
that's of course Kennedy's main thrust is public health,
Right.
and certainly he's calling attention to it in ways because those statistics they're really pretty horrendous, and um, our health outcomes are a lot worse than most countries.
Right now, roughly 1 in 36 kids have autism versus in 2000, so 24 years ago, it was 1 in 1500. That's a huge jump. Like, whatever you think is the cause of such a huge jump in autism, shouldn't that be the, front page news in the
It
world?
should certainly be investigated heavily by the
Right?
agencies that are supposed to be
Exactly.
protecting us.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Shouldn't like the government and the politicians talk about it constantly and promising that they will do everything to investigate the root cause of it?
yeah,
That should be the number one,
you would think.
right?
I mean, absolutely, and because, but I don't know. It's. I had my personal experience with pharmaceutical drugs. Is- I chronicled in a book that I wrote called My Mysterious Son, a life-changing passage between schizophrenia and shamanism. And the beginning of the book is a pretty painful story of how my son, my biracial son, was diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was 17. After comes out of nowhere, suddenly you're thrown into this world where you're getting prescribed a whole concoction of drugs to control this terrible situation that's suddenly affecting your son and your family. His mom and I didn't know any better, and I'm not saying that all the medications were terrible for him or anything, but it was this whole gamut of kind of deadening concoctions, actually, in a lot of ways, and then um, there was one drug that he was put on for a long time called Zyprexa, which was manufactured by Eli Lilly, and that they never told anybody taking it uh, that this could cause some real uh, problems, side effects. That so there was a class action suit eventually that I put my son in, and because the big side effect of this was weight gain, and my son put on almost 100 pounds on this medication, and it was terrible. We didn't know what it was, but actually he got a settlement, along with a lot of other people, because this was never. If we'd known, maybe we would have been on a different medication, right?
Right.
And so eventually, I started looking into adjuncts to the conventional medications, and went on this whole world into this new world that um, actually was very suitable for Franklin, and it was called a shamanic world, I guess you'd say, because we did a series of divinations with a very renowned West African shaman named Malidoma Somé, and eventually, long story very short, went to West Africa. Um, his mom and my ex and Franklin and I, and we went through a month-long alternative healing using these big medicine pots and bathing with them and drinking from them, and it had a tremendously positive effect. Um, it was sort of the culmination of a number of years of getting more into this world. And it's not that he did go off medication entirely, little by little, with his doctor's permission, for a period of a year, and was doing just fine after we went through this as a family. And it was very mysterious. How does this happen? I mean, with a traditional healer in West Africa and Burkina Faso,
Mhm.
um, and I think part of it was that we were doing it together as a family unit, and with other people too who were doing their own, um, taking their own journeys, I guess you'd say. And and eventually, he went off medication altogether, and then he had a crash. But it all turned out he's doing better now than he has in many, many years. I mean, since he was 17, I think.
Mhm.
And he's doing his art. He does beautiful art work, and he stays on his medication, not as much though as he used to be on.
Mhm.
And what I learned personally from this also was that to appreciate um, the other, I guess you'd say uh, the otherworldly nature of my son,
Mhm.
because he had a connection to beings somewhere else that I were Greek to me. I had no idea,
Mhm.
but and he was very psychic and had these marvelous gifts actually. And some of it I've never quite quote figured out. I mean, he spoke of a code. He kind of wrote in hieroglyphics sometimes as if he was hearkening back to
Mhm.
ancient Egypt or a whole other lifetime. And it may sound crazy to people, but it wasn't.
Mhm.
And I learned a great deal from him about that, and deeply missed the shaman Malidoma Somé that we worked with. He died a couple of years ago,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of other elements to this story, but that's one that's kind of relevant to our discussion. In the
Mhm.
sense of that it's not necessarily that Western medicine has all the answers.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. I think, um, you know, even here in the West, we had different health practices for hundreds or thousands of years, and ever since big pharma took over, it's interesting because a lot of diseases, chronic diseases, have a very, very simple solution. For
Hmm.
example, it's a deficiency of some vitamin or a
Yeah.
mineral, or just too much sugar, basically, right? Or because we're eating something that damages our gut lining, we don't absorb certain minerals or vitamins properly,
Right.
and or magnesium, for example. Like a lot of anxiety and depression is really a magnesium deficiency.
Hmm.
But the pharma, they only care about finding a solution to each disease by trying to find a drug that will cure it.
It's a lot of money in that.
Exactly. So they don't really look for a solution. They only look for pharmaceutical solution.
Yeah.
That's the only. So, and similarly with health agencies, they don't research any real solutions. They only look for pharmaceutical solutions, and uh, and because they can make money off them. But that's not how it's supposed to be, right? We pay taxes to those government agencies, hoping that they have our health in mind. And it's weird, it's almost like a mass hypnosis because a lot of very smart doctors and very smart people, they don't even consider this anymore. They just they're sort of hypnotized in that way of thinking to be in
Mhm.
that lane, and they don't consider, like, a lot of doctors that I talked to or heard, um, every time you mention diet or some natural remedies, they kind of laugh at you because they've been, and they probably really do find it funny. I don't think it's sinister. It's just that they've been programmed from the beginning
Yeah.
that that's the
Yeah.
way it is. That's how medicine works. So I think we need open mindedness and really someone who will kind of shatter the system in a way and then rebuild it from the ground up, from like the first principles. Um, and really, I think Bobby's trying to do that, which is really amazing.
Yeah, and he incorporates, I think the thing that, okay, we've talked about his addiction and how that went on for many, many years and how he's still, going through making sure that doesn't happen again.
Hmm.
What he wants to do, what he's proposed is having these centers, in different parts of the country that where kids could who have these, say the fentanyl crisis, which is huge and is killing thousands of our kids today.
Right.
So you take kids and you put them all together and let them live together and work on a farm and learn about sustainable agriculture. In other words, give them a purpose in a society that often seems like there is no purpose as you're growing up, and so the suicide rate is escalating, and it's we're living in really tough times.
Hmm.
But anyway, that's one of the things that he's talked about is having these kinds of centers at different places in the country
Hmm.
that would connect kids more to nature
Right.
and uh, and to the sense of themselves and their well-being and what eating more healthily and all of those kinds of things.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, he has a lot of really great ideas, and um, I think we are still stuck as a society in a very tribal mindset where, and that comes from, like, thousands of years ago when there were actual tribes that were competing with each other, fighting each other and competing for resources,
Hmm.
and they were probably had a lot of compassion for their family, their friends, but they were deadly enemies to other tribes, and they had no problem murdering other people, right? The same mindset is still existing right now, whereas, let's say, some guy who owns a big pharmaceutical company and maybe, or some other chemical company, let's say, um, uh, that is doing a lot of damage to the society, but really all he cares about is providing for his children, his family, and his close circle of friends.
Hmm.
And in his mind, he's a good person because he provides for those people that are close to him,
Right.
and he justifies doing all the damage to everyone else because he's doing something right for those who are close to him.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the same sort of mindset as, the tribes had thousands of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think in their mind they're doing nothing wrong because they're just trying to make a living, right? And they're really good at it, so that's great. But like if we deviate from that mindset into like actually start caring for everybody else collectively, that would solve a lot of problems. But I just wonder how can we get there, you know?
Yeah, well, it's going to take a lot. Maybe we have to be as divided as we are, and hopefully not worse, in order to kind of go and come back toward some semblance of sanity in that way. Because the countries that I mean, Kennedy said right from the front, told me, he said that there's this terrible divide in this country. It's the worst it's been since the Civil War, and who's going to do something about it? Because people don't know how to talk to each other anymore. And it's this tribal thing. If you're not towing a certain line in terms of your ideology and the way you think and who should be elected and how the party should work and all this stuff, then you're sidelined, you're ostracized, you're vilified often, like he
Hmm.
has been. And then they seize upon things like personality quirks or this whole thing with the bear in Central Park, and he did that as a joke when he was years ago. I mean, yeah, I mean it's a little weird, I guess, but
Yeah.
to make that the biggest thing you talk about somebody
Yeah.
who's trying to get some of these issues brought forward is really not right.
Yeah.
And so yeah, we're so divided in this country, and he is actually somebody who, as he's shown again, he's maybe to a fault willing to talk to people of different persuasions.
I
And
think it's a good thing though. It's just like his uncle had a direct line to Khrushchev, right? And
right,
right, then that,
yeah,
yeah, they were enemies, but the only way to keep the world safe was the fact that they could at any time talk to each other.
Yeah.
and that would diffuse any tension or any miscommunication,
And
right?
that's been so true of all of Bobby Kennedy's environmental fights.
Hmm.
He didn't care if you were a Republican or a Democrat, and he's made friends who were his enemies. Uh, Fascinating story of the New York watershed agreement years ago, and this farmer in upstate New York who was a state senator and hated Bobby Kennedy, thought he was just this, whatever radical leftist, and but they ended up with Bobby going to visit him on his farm and realized that some of these practices weren't so bad as he thought, and at the same time Dick Combs was his name. I interviewed him for the book. Was realizing, hey, this guy isn't so bad either, and then they could work together toward the same thing, which was getting protecting that watershed for the whole state, and the ups and getting some money for the upstate farmers whose land had been taken in certain cases by the city for, diversion of water and reservoirs and that kind of thing. So there was an economic factor to it that was
Hmm.
taken into consideration,
Right.
and yeah, so I mean anyway, tribalism is the
Yeah.
ruination of us if it's taken to its extreme.
Yeah. No, we have to talk to each other and like find common ground because ultimately, if we really got down deep into the root cause of someone's beliefs, everyone has good intentions. They're just everything's just so convoluted that it seems crazy. But if you see the good and humanity in everybody, you're able to reach anybody and then get pretty much anybody on your side, and that's how you change the world, not by fighting each other, because that didn't
Yeah,
get us anywhere, right?
yeah. Dialogue is communication is what it's all about.
Right, right. And I know you're writing a new book on the topic of ETs, UFOs. Can you talk about that?
Yeah,
It's
it's
an
a little bit of
interesting,
a
fascinating
it,
topic in
it
itself.
is, and it's well, it's something that you know uh, people again might consider fringe, but there's a lot going on with this, and I've
Yeah.
always been fascinated by it. Really, my whole life. I mean, since I was young, and um, uh, and so I'm going to explore this phenomenon in sort of a personal sense, not really my story, but interviewing people in different areas, like who's this lawyer, Danny Sheehan, who's started off strictly political and Pentagon Papers, Iran Contra, and so on, and has spent the last 20 years really trying to get disclosure of what's really maybe going on behind closed doors with our military and these big corporations that work for the military, in terms of maybe these craft have actually crashed, like they say it did at Roswell, and maybe we've taken some of that technology and we've kind of sequestered it so that it's not interfering with the financial uh, powers that be.
Right.
And so that's one thing that I'm looking at, but there's lots of fascinating aspects to it. uh, who was this abductee, who says he was taken aboard a ship and experiments happened with, and is that real or is it not? Or
Hmm.
is remote viewing? People have heard of that. Can you actually train people to see fascinating things that have happened in the past or even in the future? I mean,
Yeah.
these are really interesting ideas, I think, that
Yeah.
I'd like to explore.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating topic, and remote viewing, for example, it's a lot of people are not aware, but um, the government, the Pentagon, and the CIA have been having those programs, remote viewing programs, for years, for decades,
Yep.
and they've been funding them with millions of dollars. There's a lot of, and it's all public information, by the way. It's
Yeah.
not a conspiracy theory. You can find it through Freedom of Information Act.
Yep.
CIA on their official website has
Mhm.
declassified documents talking about remote viewing, which basically what it means is that remote viewer can focus and see distant places with his mind. It's clearly there's a really cool book that I read written by Russell Targ, who was a physicist. I think he's one of the inventors of laser, a
Mhm.
very smart person. And he worked on Stanford University, um, and basically was researching remote viewing and a lot of other psychic sort of abilities phenomenon. They did a lot of scientific papers, and they found in that book, it's called The Reality of ESP. You
Mm.
can read that. It's a fascinating book.
Yeah.
In there, he uh, says that basically, based on all the hundreds of scientific studies that they have done, the probability that ESP or remote viewing is not real it's like one in trillions, basically,
Hmm.
based on like scientific rigor, right? So it's almost impossible that it's not real based on all the studies they did. It is absolutely real. We don't know how it works, but we also don't investigate it. There's no money being put into any actual studies, big studies that would explain this phenomenon. For some reason, we are staying away from that. It's clearly there's something going on, and we definitely should investigate that.
Yeah, well, we only use a very minuscule portion of our brains,
Yeah.
and people who now there's a resurgence in interest in psychedelics, and that was around when I was young, but now it's really, gone to a whole another level again with um, the not just the idea, but the evidence that, say, psilocybin mushrooms are very helpful with people who are on the edge of transitioning to the next world,
Hmm.
and helps them in those times. And DMT is something we all have, and it's dimethyltryptamine, I think it's called,
Right.
and we all have that in our bodies and in our brains.
Hmm.
Interestingly, I got interested in it a few years back, not to take it, but to study it a little bit, because in the brains of so-called schizophrenics, like my son had, there's more DMT in their brains
Hmm.
because they have this connection to other worlds
Hmm.
than than normal people.
Right.
And then there was experiments done, I don't know why particularly on this topic, but since we're talking about it,
Yeah.
and in the 90s, there was a man named Rick Strassman whom I spoke with at the University of New Mexico, I think, and he did studies. They were like laboratory studies, so controlled studies where they would give people a small amount of DMT, which is, by the way, one of the ingredients in ayahuasca, which is a plant
Hmm.
medicine that's become very well known in recent years too, from mostly from Brazil and these countries. But there's DMT is one of the ingredients of ayahuasca, for example. So people would take this TMT, I think, but they give them a shot, and they would just sort of fly out somewhere for 10 minutes,
Hmm.
and almost all these people came back reporting the same thing, which is that they had encountered beings,
Hmm.
otherworldly, beings from somewhere, and that some of them were glad to see them,
Hmm.
and some of them were not happy to see them at all.
Okay.
And then they'd come back, but all these stories were the same, and it fascinated this researcher.
Right.
He ended up doing a whole book about it, which I forget the name of it, but it's out there.
Hmm.
So, by way of saying, there's these abilities that are just that are inside us, or capabilities that we could explore these other worlds through, sort of time travel in a sense,
Yeah.
and develop this is extrasensory perception, right?
Hmm.
Um, that, yes, the government has been studying for
Hmm.
a long time, and with remote viewing, which you talked about, was really fascinating. There was a guy gave a talk about this at a recent conference I went to, where the same viewers, with, again, it was they did it blindfolded, so
Hmm.
you're not seeing where you're going,
Right.
and you're not doing it with somebody all at once. These are separate studies that are being conducted,
Right.
but these viewers would report the same thing,
Hmm.
and in some cases they reported, oh, there's a base,
Yeah.
these guys came back and said there was an extraterrestrial base
Hmm.
in Alaska, in this mountain or whatever it
Yeah.
was. There were several instances of
Yeah.
this.
I heard about that.
And I mean, is it
Yeah.
crazy, or why are these people all having the same
Yeah.
vision?
Yeah. I honestly think you need to be open minded and like, like even that example that 100 years ago, people didn't really know anything about cell phones, or if you showed them a computer, they would think
Hmm.
it's magic, and it's only 100 years. It's nothing.
Yeah,
Yeah, we have to be open minded because people who think we've discovered all there is in science are quite short sighted, I think.
I think so too.
Like the way we're going, the advancements we're having, in 100 years, we will have things that people think are magic right now or bullshit. I'm certain of that. There's no doubt.
Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
we have to be aware that things like AI have a perhaps positive side, but also perhaps a very dangerous, uh, as we rely more and more just on technology. If it's technology without a conscience, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
uh, we could be in real trouble.
We
and
could, yeah.
so that's an aspect I think we've got to be
Yeah.
aware of too.
It's interesting because it's very hard to predict how AI will develop, and since it's so much more advanced in a way in certain areas than the human brain, it can in fact have no conscience, or it can have much better conscience than human, right? And it's hard to predict how it's gonna go,
Yeah,
like because we as humans have not been really good at certain things, keeping peace, for example, and stuff
right.
like that. So the question is like, if we have developed super intelligence, part of, you know, higher development maybe is the fact that it would be more peaceful and would strive for peace. Just like, with the ETs, there's a lot of theories that if there are those other civilizations from other planets, other worlds, and they are coming here, they clearly have better technology than we do because they are able to be here just for that reason alone. Um, but they're not being hostile. They're being, and I think Dr. Stephen Greer talks about it, that in order to get to that point level of advancement in technology, you also have to at the same time advance spiritually. Um, Otherwise, you'll just destroy yourself before you even can get there, right? So in order to be at that level, you also have to be developed spiritually. Um, and that means that not being hostile, living in peace and understanding, not being tribal. And uh, so question is, if AI really is so advanced and will be more advanced than us, does it mean that it will help us get to that peaceful place? Maybe.
Hmm.
I'm A lot of people are saying it's going to be the opposite, that AI will murder us because we're basically um, seeing AI as just a better human, right? And humans always have been very violent. But if it is more advanced than humans, perhaps we'll be not hostile, we'll be peaceful,
Yeah, I
right?
mean,
Who knows?
who knows? Well, we're going to have, since we're creating it,
Yeah.
we're going to have choices to make in where we go with it, and yeah, I mean, the thing about, you mentioned Stephen Greer, he's an interesting person, because he uses meditation, Sanskrit meditation.
Hmm.
Went to a recent event
Yeah. That's where
where I
we
met
met.
you.
Yeah.
Uh, it's called CE5,
Yeah.
trying to use meditation in a group setting.
Hmm.
This was hundreds of 500 people in one place
Right.
under the night sky
In California
in
here. Yeah.
California, to call in. Is there a visitor out there that wants to come see us?
Yeah.
Let's all meditate on that and
Hmm.
see what we can do. And there has been some real successful
Yeah.
efforts in that. I can't say that the one I was at,
Yeah.
I saw,
Well,
amazingly miraculous things, but
yeah.
I know that other people have had that experience. So
Yeah.
it's very interesting. It's a connection to the spiritual world
Yeah.
that moves toward that.
For sure, yeah. No, that's that event we both went to. There was a lot of talks, lectures, and at night we would sit, meditate under the sky. There's a lot of documented events where people see lights in the sky, different phenomena and stuff like that. We haven't seen that really at the event, but my anecdote is that after the event, I went to Palm Springs, and during the day, I told you about this. I can actually in the podcast show the photos, so everyone can see. The next day, I took some pictures of mountains in Palm Springs just because they look beautiful. It was a really nice day, middle of the day. And hours later, I was just reviewing photos, and in those photos, I've seen a disc with like glowing disc in the sky. And there were two photos, then that object moved from one place to another. I've never seen anything like that, but that was, kind of a nice confirmation that there's something going on. There's something out there.
Yeah, when I was earlier at the Contact in the Desert, which was where I decided I was going to do this as a book. We actually, a whole bunch of people saw this triangular objects going across the sky
Really?
and there was no doubt about it. And at this one, I remember Dr. Greer. We were meditating, and my eyes were closed, and I was picturing a landscape. He was supposed to be thinking you were on some other planet or something, but maybe I was. But I was picturing a landscape. It was very green and beautiful, and sort of a mountainous area too, and trees and so on. And so my eyes were closed, and then came out of that, and Dr. Greer said, in that tree, which was actually right next to me, um, I saw a craft come
Yeah.
into that tree. I mean, it was
I
like, oh, well, maybe my consciousness helped call that in.
yeah.
I mean, I don't know. But anyway, it was kind of, again, sort
Yeah.
of confirmation that at
Yeah.
least somebody saw that. It's
Yeah,
pretty
yeah,
cool.
yeah. You did say it, I remember. And it's fascinating, but also just it's worth remembering that I mean, there's a lot of congressional testimonies with a lot of
Yeah.
whistleblowers from army are coming out and talking about their experiences, and it's literally thousands of people over the course of decades, right? It's been going on since the 50s. So this many people have seen, and those are serious people.
Yeah.
Those are people from the Navy, from the Air Force, very serious people that were not crazy at all, and they are reporting all those things for so long. And now the Pentagon is admitting that they actually did admit, right, that they have non-human craft. They recovered
Well, not the
something.
Pentagon per se, but they have, there are people from
Yeah,
within the military. And David Grush was one who gave congressional testimony a little over a year ago,
yeah.
who was in this program and said that he didn't see them himself, but he's had people who are he's
Mhm.
close to talk to him about there's not only crashed craft that have been recovered and sort of back engineered using the technology,
Mhm.
but also even quote alien bodies
Yeah.
that have been recovered. And this guy he's a very credible guy. I mean,
Mhm.
and he's telling this to the United States Congress under oath.
Yeah.
So that's pretty interesting. And then another fellow that I've recently met, Luis Elizondo,
Mhm.
just came out with a book, and he's revealing a lot of things in that book that have been covered up over the years,
Mhm.
or at least I don't know if intentionally covered up, but that they have not wanted to release,
Yeah.
been suppressed, and yet he got permission actually from the Pentagon. Some they edited little pieces of his book. I've just started to read it. Um, uh, kind of okay, you can't say right where this location was or something, but they've basically reviewed his book and allowed him to publish it.
Mhm.
So there's something going on. I think that we're going to see. There's a big effort at disclosure. It's called,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of discussion now that um, we may not see the actual craft or bodies, but we're going to get admissions that these kinds of things have been going on for quite a long time,
Yeah.
and so that's going to change consciousness. That's going to
Mhm.
alter how we look at
Yeah.
the world and other worlds, and
Yeah.
our relationships, and one hopes that I mean, some military people, perhaps just because of that mindset, but they think, oh, this is a national security threat. We've got to get the word out about this because we could be invaded.
Mhm.
I don't think that that's necessarily true.
I don't think so. Just instinctually, I don't think that's the case.
I don't
But
either.
yeah.
But then again, there could be different stuff going on that we don't
Yeah.
know about. But it's a fascinating time that we're living in terms of this particular subject.
Yeah. Very
And
fascinating. There's a lot of people that say that the reason we're being visited is because they somehow want to help us advance as a human species.
yeah,
And we really need to advance because, given our capabilities with nuclear weapons, for example, but even with viruses, right now, since we obviously know how to engineer viruses and modify them to make them extremely deadly or very infectious and stuff like that, it's out there.
yeah,
So it's just a matter of time. Like if the US or China can do that in a lab, it means anyone with a budget in a lab could do that. And it just takes one crazy person to release something out
mm,
in the world that will potentially kill millions or more, right?
yeah,
Decimate the human race. So we have now the capability, not just from nuclear weapons, but even from biological standpoint, to destroy our erase our everything we've been working for thousands of years. So if we don't spiritually and psychologically advance to the next level and become peaceful, then we will eventually. It's a mathematical probability that we will destroy ourselves. It's just a matter of when. um, so it is a very important time, I think.
yeah, and that's really where this phenomenon started back in the late 40s after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima,
Hmm.
and that's when the numbers of sightings of unidentified UFOs, unidentified flying objects, and now called UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena began to happen. And when the Roswell crash, 1947, a couple months before I was born, actually,
Mm.
uh, happened, and it was because whoever these entities, beings were, or where they were coming from, they were worried that we now had the capability as a species to wipe out our species,
Mhm.
and maybe it would have some impact on the upper atmosphere as well. I mean, they were very concerned about this for whatever reason, and they were coming and spending a lot of time around our military bases where these nuclear
Yeah.
weapons were being held.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard those reports that they would come to nuclear sites and mess with the equipment,
Yeah,
and even Russians the same. They
yeah.
apparently the same kind of stories. So yeah, it is very fascinating, and a lot of people are sort of opening up their minds to it. In fact, it's funny. Like when you talk to people, most of them do believe that there is something out there, but a lot of people are kind of they're afraid of being labeled as crazy or whatever. But I think it's sort of fading away.
Yeah, I think there's less stigma attached to it now,
Yeah.
and hopefully, with all these, I mean, it's called New Age, and people are into all this kind of stuff, but I think we are actually, and cosmically too. If you look at the Mayan calendar and those things, which there's a reality in those things, I believe.
Mhm.
We're on the cusp of a whole new age astrologically.
Mhm.
We're entering the age of Aquarius, and it's been sung about and all of that, but I think it's also a very real huge transition turning point in our you know our life as a on this planet,
Mhm.
and may have something to do with other planets too. And so
Yeah.
I think we need to be open-minded about those things. And indeed, it's in 2017 the New York Times finally did a front page story on this
Yeah.
new move toward releasing some of these documents, and recently did a front page story. I found this interesting. There's a Lakota Sioux prophecy uh, that has to do with the birth of a white buffalo calf. It's crazy, right? But
Mhm.
that and when there were people at this conference I went to in June called Contact in the Desert, who were having a meditative session at this kind of sacred rock, ahead of time and like that, and a number of them were dreaming that this white buffalo calf was born,
Mhm.
and then it happened in Yosemite just a week or two later.
Wow.
And so it's really kind of okay. And then the New York Times does a front page story
Really? They did that?
that
Okay.
there's a because it's connected to a prophecy that when this white buffalo calf
Mhm.
returns, and I guess there was one born in 1994 too, uh, that it marks a really big event that's coming.
Mhm.
Hopefully a positive one,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's a big deal.
Yeah. No, I definitely feel that I have like the inner knowing that something big is coming, and it's a positive thing. And it's also interesting because in any case, like in a personal life, but also on a big civilization scale, in order for something good to happen, for a breakthrough to happen, there has to be something bad happening first.
Mm,
There is no light without darkness, right?
hmm
So we have gone through a lot of dark days,
Yeah.
there is a lot of corruption, there is a lot of bad people, bad actors, and but without those people, we would not be able to talk about this right now
hmm
and just realize what's really important.
Yep.
There would be no awakening before if there was no
There's
dark forces out there,
there's
right?
no there's no light without the dark,
Yeah,
and we've been going through a very very dark period.
yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, we're having this discussion today, and
mhm,
just maybe other people will get
yeah.
more interested in some of these things, and
Hopefully, yeah,
that's the way to do it.
I do hope so.
Well, it's great talking to you about it.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
appreciate
Really
that.
enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too.